Welcome to The Explainer. We're jumping right in today because we have a really compelling and honestly pretty intense theory to unpack from political commentator Glenn Beck. He's proposing something major: the idea that threats against U.S. leaders have fundamentally transformed. His theory argues that we've completely moved away from the era of isolated impulsive incidents and entered a new reality of coordinated systemic destabilization. The source material outlines how these assassination attempts have totally morphed in their methodology, their execution, and their ultimate goals. So we're going to break down exactly how this argument is constructed.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To understand this complex theory, we're going to methodically break down the source's arguments using this roadmap: the old model, timeline of escalating threats, a shift to destabilization, foreign influence and plots, the ideological climate, and finally, connecting the dots. Starting with Section 1, the old assassination model.
So the old model, it was actually pretty simple. One person, one weapon. Think back to the squeaky frame incident with Gerald Ford or John Hinckley Jr. targeting Ronald Reagan. It was impulsive, fast, rash, and close range, like someone desperately lunging to grab a police officer's gun. But this brilliantly illustrates how Beck's theory argues we've completely moved on to a new model. And this one, it's highly calculated. We're talking meticulous planning, distance, infiltration, and in some cases, literally geopolitical reach.
Which brings us to Section 2, timeline of escalating threats. Let's actually walk through how this escalation has unfolded chronologically. Back in 2016, in Las Vegas, we kind of saw the very end of that old model: a guy at a rally trying to grab a cop's gun at close range. But just 1 year later, in 2017, things start to dramatically shift. We see a forklift attack aimed at a motorcade purely for disruption. The source compares this pivot to the difference between, say, planting a bomb in a basement versus flying planes into a building. The attackers are looking for massive disruption and spectacle now. Fast forward to 2020, and they aren't even in the same room anymore. A Ricin letter introduces this scary element of distance. You no longer need physical access, you just exploit a system. And then, well, we hit 2024, and this is where distance, planning, and scale just dangerously accelerate, with things like sniper rifles, stalking, and elevation.
And that brings us right to the specifics of the 2024 attacks. The source points to the Butler, Pennsylvania incident as a massive, glaring red flag. It's basically a textbook example of this new model we're talking about. You've got calculated elevation, you've got distance, but Beck emphasizes something even more concerning here: the severe security gaps. I mean, warnings were totally missed. People literally saw the shooter on the roof, but that roof was left completely unguarded. The theory argues this wasn't just some chaotic, random act. The fact that a bullet grazed the target under these highly planned circumstances, it points to a literal systemic failure point in our protective systems.
Moving on to Section 3, a shift to destabilization.
Now, here's where the ultimate goal of these bad actors shifts. The source introduces this concept called a decapitation event, and it's exactly as intense as it sounds. We're talking about an attack aimed not just at one figure on a golf course, but at an entire room full of U.S. leadership, with the clear intent to fundamentally disrupt the constitutional order. To back this up, the theory points to a specific incident where an armed man actually forced his way into a room in Washington, D.C. filled with top government officials. Shots were fired, a Secret Service agent was hit, though thankfully survived. But Beck's argument here is that if an attack like that were to succeed, it wouldn't just be an assassination. It would be total, absolute destabilization of the American government.
Let's look at Section 4, foreign influence and plots.
So, the threat matrix expands way beyond domestic actors here. Federal prosecutors have uncovered actual plots tied directly to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and they weren't just targeting one figure, but multiple U.S. leaders. On top of that, there was a plot linked to ISIS sympathizers trying to breach Mar-a-Lago. And the source also flags millions in foreign funding flowing in from hostile actors in China and the Middle East. So neutrally presenting the source's claims regarding this geopolitical terrorism, we have to ask, if foreign money and sophisticated operatives are actively testing our systems, why are these specific signals allegedly being ignored?
That takes us to Section 5, the ideological climate. Now, how does all this tie into our domestic environment? Well, the theory connects these physical threats directly to our highly charged political rhetoric. The source highlights this quote from a Michigan Senate candidate who openly agreed with parallels between their political opposition and Nazi Germany, warning of an authoritarian slide. Beck argues that this specific type of extreme political framing creates a super dangerous environment. When political figures paint their opponents as literal authoritarians or Nazis, the argument is that it shifts blame and inadvertently justifies really extreme, even violent opposition.
And we're seeing this rhetoric manifest into direct action. Take this stark example from the source.
Just this past weekend, a Pennsylvania Senate candidate was arrested for leaving graphic voicemails. They were threatening to slit a Republican challenger's throat, along with making direct threats against the president. This is presented as clear-cut evidence of just how tense and hostile the climate has become, where political anger is transforming into very real, concrete threats of violence. But the ideology goes even further than that, taking aim at the country as a whole. The source shares this incredibly intense quote from a speaker named Mohammed Abdu during a university tour at Virginia Tech. He stated, quote, "When we say death to America, we mean, and loud and clear, a total end to U.S. empire, the destruction of this crusading settler column." Beck uses this as evidence that ideological extremists are operating entirely out in the open now, openly pushing the narrative that the United States fundamentally needs to collapse and be destroyed. Finally, Section 6, Connecting the Dots. So, what does this all mean when we bring it together? The crucial point is this layered threat matrix. The core argument is that the old lone gunman model hasn't just evolved, it's been completely swallowed up by a massive multi-layered system of threats. You still have those impulsive lone actors, sure, but now you stack ideological extremists right on top of that. Then you add distance and infiltration attacks. You factor in those glaring security gaps and systemic failure points. And finally, you top the whole thing off with sophisticated foreign intelligence plots. All of this is happening at the exact same time. Which brings us to a final, really provocative question to leave you with. Are we missing the bigger picture here? Are we still trying to view highly systematic, well-funded international threats of destabilization through that outdated, comfortable lens of a lone gunman? It's a challenging question about a rapidly shifting landscape, and one the source insists we really can't afford to ignore anymore. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.